might want to start our preparations for a birth of new life and beginnings, we have to deal with the ending first. Certainly in the beginning days of the Christian church, many new followers believed the end of this upstart faith had arrived. To some, it was the beginning of the end. So just in the nick of time, a man named John wrote a letter to some struggling congregations in the first century. Now, I'm going to try to explain some things to you about the book of Revelation and perhaps dispel some misunderstandings that always seem to be floating around. So here goes. Revelation is a letter that was written to some Christian congregations struggling to survive in what is now the region of Western Turkey. The author of the letter is thought to be a teacher or itinerant preacher who was living on the island of Patmos. He writes about his vision for the early followers of Christ who were dealing with all sorts of problems and challenges. This person, John, is probably not the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John. The letter our author, John, wrote was most likely written sometime during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian. Here's what was happening. As you might know, in the days of the Roman rule, the emperor was everything. He was the supreme leader, the one in charge. He was considered to be a god among gods. In other words, everyone was expected to worship the emperor as a god. Well, as you can imagine, that notion didn't work too well with a young Christian community sprouting up those days. Now, for the most part, Romans weren't too concerned with other religious practices that they conflicted with all the gods the Romans worshipped. As long as everyone at least paid lip service to worshiping the emperor, no one was too upset. So in light of increasing persecution of Christians, some of these early followers of Christ decided that it wouldn't hurt to worship the emperor. So some of them urged other members to pay attention to the emperor. After all, they reasoned, idols had no real sacred power. So a few church leaders urged the members of the congregation to go through the motions and rituals surrounding the civil religion. In their hearts, Christians understood the emptiness of the rituals and therefore could fake their worship without actually sinning. Talk about rationalization. Revelation strongly rejects the arguments of those who advocated this solution in the precarious circumstances in which the early followers of Christ faced. The people who comprised the congregation in the first century found themselves separated from their community and often their families. It was extremely difficult, if not downright impossible, to follow Christ without having to sacrifice a comfortable life with family and friends. Now, none of these writings in Revelation should be taken as normative for Christian faith today. So whenever you decide to read the book of Revelation, remember the context in which it was created. Indeed, the author of Revelation is pointing out in today's reading that the king of the Roman Empire is not the God to be worshipped. There is only one king as far as Christians are concerned, and that king is Jesus the Christ. And in those days, acknowledging Christ as the one and only king might just cost a person his or her life. It was downright dangerous to follow Christ and to announce that only Christ was king. It was just plain treason. So this is a letter that contains a vision of healing and the author tells of his vision for the Christian church. The vision our author shares with the church is one in which Christ as King is not that is a tyrant. Rather, Christ the King is one who loves. Christ the King in Revelation is not a power man despot. Everyone is forced to serve or else. Instead, he's a loving and serving witness to others. Christ is the beginning and end, the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Now, our gospel lesson today also deals with kings and just what sort of understanding we have about kings or emperors. It's the night before Jesus' death, and he is standing in front of Pilate. Poor Pilate. He never could figure out what he did to deserve a post as bad as Jerusalem. The desert made him miss Rome and the cool breeze of the Mediterranean. When he was young, Pilate dreamed of greater things than being a Roman governor of Judea. But it could have been worse. After all, he is a friend of the emperor. Pilate's sons get the best education money could buy. His wife is unstable, but she has a good therapist. Yet the Jews befuddle Pilate. They claim to worship a God who runs history, and history keeps running over them. And now every time religious holidays roll around, there is trouble, and this year is no exception. Pilate is rather irritated when the temple leaders bring Jesus to him. Why are you bringing this guy to me? I've heard about this preacher, but what does he have to do with Rome? The leaders quickly replied, we wouldn't have brought him here if he wasn't a threat. And in the end, the temple leaders want to have Jesus executed. Pilate wants the whole thing to go away. He just isn't willing to deal with Jesus. He would give anything if he could only send Jesus back to Interland. But Pilate is stuck. So now he has to come up with some sort of excuse. He decides to ask Jesus a few questions. And so he blurts out, tell me, Jesus, are you really the King of the Jews? Now might be a good time to think a little bit about our image of kings or emperors. Close your eyes and pretend you see a powerful king standing in front of you. What do you see? Do you see someone with a golden crown full of sparkling jewels, dressed in velvet and ermine? Maybe he has a sword in his hand. Does the king have people surrounding him? Are there trumpets blaring, announcing his arrival? Does he look commanding and in charge? Does he seem larger than life? Does he expect you to bow down and fear him? Or perhaps you have another image of kings. We're being swamped with all sorts of kings, especially the retail sales kings, giants of marketing and selling. Once again, we've been told over and over by all sorts of clever kings to go out and shop, shop, shop. We're being told that due to a shipping crisis, we need to get ourselves going on our holiday shopping. For what seems like months, advertisers are tempting us with all sorts of so-called Black Friday specials, evidently waiting until the day after Thanksgiving to begin our Christmas rush might just be too late this year. And year after year, we've all seen pictures of long lines of people camping out in order to get some sort of amazing bargain on the perfect television or computer or other high-tech gadget that we've been told we must have in order to survive the holidays. Marketing is truly a king in our world today. Great marketing as king has entered our faith world as well. A New York Times reporter visiting recently a booming mega church in Phoenix found this scene: a drive-through latte stand, Krispy Kreme donuts at every service, and sermons about how to discipline your children, how to reach your professional goals, how to invest your money, how to reduce your debt. Children played with church-distributed Xboxes, and many in the congregation signed up for the twice-weekly aerobics classes called Firm Believers. A list of bestsellers compiled by the Christian Booksellers Association illuminates the creed. In other words, the church has marketed and is selling itself to those whose lives are self-absorbed in the kingship of owning the best, the most, and having it all. This is a church that is devoted to a God who meets our demands and grants our wishes. This church reminds us that we live in a market society with a management economy, hundreds of companies with the same product. Whoever markets and manages the best wins. On the other hand, this was Jesus' marketing scheme. He chose 12 guys to be with him, 12 guys the world would consider losers. As far as we know, not one of them chose 12 more guys to duplicate the scheme. At one point, the crowd tried to make Jesus king as someone who controlled and ruled with power and might. Jesus ran away. Not a good move as far as marketing goes. In the New Testament, Jesus healed people, ate with sinners, reached out to the helpless and lonely, embraced the powerless and poor. Not a great marketing technique these days. So then, just who is Jesus? He certainly didn't fit the image Pilate had for a king. Jesus stood in front of Pilate with his hands tied behind his back, his upper lip puffed out, and with one eye swollen shut. He was dirty and unwashed. In every way, Jesus would seem to be a loser, certainly not a king. No wonder Pilate gave up in disgust and handed him over to be killed. It was all too much for our poor friend Pilate. So then, just what is it about Jesus that brings us here to worship every Sunday? What is it we're supposed to see in Jesus that Pilate, the Roman Empire, and countless others couldn't see? If a king is supposed to be a ruler, a person of power and control, a person to fear, then clearly Jesus doesn't then measure up to anyone's king expectations. Even the disciples were confused. They had great expectations, along with all of the crowds who had come to see and hear Jesus. No wonder they went home disappointed and disillusioned. Here they were, expecting Jesus to conquer the Romans with power, might, and glory. They expected a brand new world where they would be in charge and have it their way. But instead, they have a king who rides on a donkey, who weeps over the poor and oppressed. Instead of a king with a crown and a throne who commands obedience and instills fear, we have a king who is bleeding, broken, and eventually killed. Truly, this is a king who can make us extremely uncomfortable, who compels us to look in the mirror and figure out just who we are. Jesus as king calls us to love our enemies, share what we have with the poor, and give up our notions of what the marketing world considers to be a successful life. In the days and weeks ahead, as we prepare for the coming of the newborn Christ, we look in the mirror and see a reflection of God's goodness and love. And we be a reflection of a king who came to serve and not to be served. And we know that we belong to the servant king, who leads and cares for us and calls us home. May all we say and do demonstrate to the world that we are truly a reflection of God's goodness, and that we are called to serve and to love our neighbors as we are loved by God. In the end, let's begin to prepare for a king who will transform our lives. Amen. I invite you now to join me in litany of thanksgiving as we celebrate the coming of the Thanksgiving holiday on Thursday. For every breath we take, for every beat of our hearts, for every sensation of our bodies,
we give you thanks, O God.
For the ear that listens, for the hand that caresses, for the arms that reach out in love.
We give you thanks, O God.
For relief from pain, for the tears of shared sorrow, for the laughter of shared joy.
We give you thanks, O God.
For the freedom to choose, for the ability to love, for the power of hope.
We give you thanks, O God.
For the presence you reveal to us, for the courage you offer us, for the rest you assure us will be ours.
We give you thanks, O God.
Thank the choir and the special music.